I'm David Flint.
And I'm Martinkovits.
Thank you for joining us for this very first episode of this current affairs program with a central theme, Give Us Back Our Country.
The essence of this is to make the politicians truly accountable, not just every 3 or 4 years where we give them a blank check, but let's make them truly accountable to you on every day of every week and of every year. This new show builds on the concepts outlined in a book David and I jointly authored last year called Give Us Back Our Country. A second edition was released earlier this year following the election of the Abbott government. Right across the country, from Sydney to Perth, from Darwin to Hobart, there is a feeling that something is very wrong with the way in which our country is being governed.
People believe the country which their forebears built and fought and died for has been lost to the power brokers within the major political parties. It's time to demand that they give us back our country. Give us back our country is not just an empty mantra. There is, we believe, a way of doing this.
Australia is one of the world's oldest continuing democracies, yet our institutions of representative democracy have been compromised.
They've been compromised by the power brokers, the faceless men in the major political parties.
Many of our politicians today seem to be lacking the basic common sense, good judgment and decency of the average Australian.
The agenda they're applying with the inner city elites would just not pass the pub test.
Yeah, obviously everyone's got their vote and they have their little bit of a say, but in the end of the day, the politicians do what they want, not really what we want.
I'm basically held accountable in my position. However, the politicians are not held accountable between elections. So they might come out and say one thing at the start of their campaign, and then as they become elected, they do the completely opposite.
Yeah, they're not thinking in the people, they think of themselves and the pocket.
I don't think much of them, to be honest.
I think they just say what people really want them to hear.
It's unfair.
Yeah, when the politicians say something, I don't always believe it.
I think they do no justice to our vote. We vote for them, we honestly believe what they're going to say. If they don't fulfil it, then we hopefully get rid of them next time.
If they should make a promise, they should keep it.
I guess it's not very fair on the people who they make the promises to, I guess.
I don't know how you'd change it to make it any better, but I'm sure there's a better way.
They should be kicked out.
Increasingly, Australians are demanding that our politicians be truly accountable, not just every 3 or 4 years in blank check elections.
Truly accountable, as nurses, doctors and journalists are accountable on every day of every week, of every month and of every year, just as you are. The Abbott government says the 2014 budget is a crisis budget. The opposition says this is an invention. They say we've got AAA status, but that AAA status was restored due to the efforts of the Howard and Costello government. They compare us with other countries which are much more indebted. True, 38.27% of the GDP is in hock. That's more than China, Russia, Mexico or South Korea. Well, we're not like Ireland with over 1,000% of our GDP in hock. Approaching 40% doesn't look too good for a country which had a tiny debt only 6 or 7 years ago. And remember, we've got no buffer. Unlike the Americans, our dollar's not a reserve currency which protects us from the immediate rigours of the market. We don't belong to the European Union. We can hardly ask Germany to bail us out. If we get into financial trouble, nobody will help us. We're on our own. We can't go to Mr. Rudd or Miss Gallard asking them to give us back their taxpayer-funded pensions, their chauffeurs, their top-class aeroplane flights around the world. There is one common-sense way of looking at this, exactly the way you rank-and-file Australians would, and that's the interest bill. It's about $12 billion annually and mounting, $1 billion a month, or $24 billion if you add in the debts incurred by all the politicians, federal, state and local. If nothing were done about this in a decade, we'd be owing $48 billion, living beyond our means. Or rather, the politicians would be living beyond your means. What could we do with this sort of money? What did we get for over $600 billion debt, which you and your children must repay? We could have had every year for this interest, we could have had every year 8 hospitals of the standard of the new Royal Adelaide Hospital, which has over 800 beds. We could build dams, fast trains. We could buy a whole new fleet of the most modern fighters for the RAAF. Now, the other way of looking at this is to ask what we got for the vast amount of money the politicians spent. We've got an NBN, which is going to cost us, according to the Macquarie Bank, $96 billion. Some say it's going to cost us $200 billion. We spent $3 billion on a pink bats insulation scheme, which set houses on fire and killed 4 young men. We spent $15 billion on building the education revolution, with about $5 billion lost on overpriced tendering. No one with any common sense would have ever done any of this. It's surely another reason to make our politicians accountable 24/7, so this can never, ever happen again.
Well, there's no doubt that there is a crisis which needs to be dealt with in some way, shape or another. But in terms of the response that we've seen, what have your thoughts been around the way it's been dealt with?
Well, whatever you think of the budget, and it is an attempt to clean up the mess. You may not agree with it, but it's an attempt to clean up the mess. The opposition seems to be just saying, we won't pay for this, we won't stop this. It's just no, 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 as Mr. Abbott was once accused of. But the opposition hasn't said what they would do. They haven't admitted
Well,
that
they
the
don't
mess is
admit that
theirs.
there's a problem.
Yes.
They don't see that fundamental point, and I think we've clearly seen that we're living well beyond our means. The actual value that we've received for that, it hasn't been some infrastructure which is going to serve us. I mean, there may well be occasions where we need to borrow, which is appropriate, and you build infrastructure which is going to increase your capacity and serve you for the long term. But these failed, bungled projects, which have been an absolute disaster, have left us in the disaster that we find ourselves now.
Yes, exactly. And there's no way that we can continue in the same way. We have to do something different. We have to get over politicians wasting money on useless projects. We have to make them accountable. We also have to change the handout mentality which they've infested the country with.
So if we look at it, I suppose there's 2 ways. You either do what we're seeing a degree of, which is to increase the amount of money coming into the government coffers from you and I and other taxpayers, or we can cut. And what's your thoughts around whether we've seen enough cutting?
Well, we haven't seen enough cutting. The foreign aid budget, most of which seems to go to help countries, the rich in other countries. They say that foreign aid is the poor in a rich country funding the rich in a poor country. And that's what happens. So much money goes on consultants and all sorts of other people. It goes to governments which are quite happy to spend an enormous amount of money on arms. That should be significantly reduced. And remember, they only increased it so we could buy a useless temporary seat on the United Nations Security Council.
How much of a constraint has it been? Because obviously before the election, going into the election, there were several promises that were held out, no cuts to the ABC, the SBS and so on. How much of a constraint has that been about what should have been done, cuts that should have been made, which obviously we haven't seen?
Well, it hasn't been the absolute constraint which the opposition would like, and considering that they've been prepared to decide that what they said then was no longer applicable, they should just go ahead, I think, and cut things. For example, the renewable energy program, the various programs in relation to the climate. We could spend the whole gross domestic product on changing the climate. It would not affect the temperature by a minuscule degree of the temperature. We could abandon all of that and it would make no difference. It would put a few rich people out of work, but it would make no difference. They could very easily, I think, remove the deficit this year.
But the other thing is there has to be a degree, or certainly a openness and a transparency. And these are the things you say when you're going into the election. You don't decide after, well, we've said we're going to keep this program and cut it. I think that it should have been said going into the election that we think that this is making absolutely no practical difference and we intend to fully cut that spending. And that's the way to do it. And I think that most of mainstream Australia would say, well, that's a very sensible thing to do.
That's because the present system is such that politicians expect that the election is the only time at which they will be accountable. If they knew they were going to be accountable all of the time, as they are in a number of states of the United States, as they are in Switzerland, they would have a different mindset and they wouldn't concentrate everything on an event every 3 or 4 years when they promise everything and then after the election realise that they can't fulfil those promises.
And of course the wonderful thing with having these tools available to the people is the people don't necessarily have to exercise their abilities in that way. Just the mere threat of those abilities is enough to keep the politicians in line and to know their place.
Yes. So in summary, we think that the budget is going in the right direction, not far enough, and that what would be important would be to put in place systems of accountability to make the politicians accountable all of the time, not just in these confected elections.
Absolutely. Even as recently as in the budget speech, the Australian government reinforced that it intends to proceed with a second airport in Sydney at Badgerys Creek. But although so many questions remain unanswered, Western Sydney residents could be forgiven for believing that they've been presented with a fait accompli. Dribs and drabs of enabling infrastructure have been announced, but it's a drop in the ocean. It's claimed that the building cost of the airport will be around $2.3 billion. But industry experience dictates that for every dollar we spend inside the fence, we're going to need to spend $2 or $3 outside the fence. And with such minimal spending announced, we have to ask ourselves, is this a raw deal? What is for certain is that the government will not enjoy the support from Western Sydney unless the essential roads and rail connections are delivered before the second airport is operational. But there is a more fundamental issue. On this show, we'll be talking a lot about common sense. And common sense suggests that you don't go ahead with something else until you've got the most out of what you've already got. Proponents seem to readily ignore the real capacity potential of Sydney Airport and its surrounding land. The airport is, well, certainly by international standards, remarkably well located, and unlike Badgerys Creek, offers the potential for safe and quiet departures and approaches over the sea. We must exploit this asset to its full potential. There's also a host of operational, economic and environmental reasons why a second airport at Sydney at Badgerys Creek is simply bad policy. We should always be sceptical when assessing these proposals. Is a second airport at Western Sydney a good idea, or will it be yet another white elephant?
John, is it true that the curfew at Sydney only applies to passenger planes, that cargoes still come in overnight?
That's right. Cargo planes have no curfew. There is obviously differing degrees of capacity depending on how you look at it, but there's a general consensus that there's a lot more capacity without even adjusting curfews, certainly for passenger movements. And if we were to look at curfews, we'd get even more. But some would say up to 50% without even touching the capacity.
So what you're saying is reserve Badgerys Creek, have it ready, have all the infrastructure in place, and that'll do it. Have they said how they're going to get fuel out to Badgerys Creek?
Well, that's another significant problem. There are so many operational questions, and there's obviously various infrastructure that needs to be put in place to deliver that fuel. And at the moment, that's going to mean that on existing roads, which are already at significant capacity, we're going to be introducing trucks and tankers to deliver that fuel. And it would be quite a hefty load of fuel that's required. So how many more trucks and tankers and so on can we put on the roads? It's simply not a long-term viable solution. We need to put in place the enabling infrastructure first. These infrastructure projects are not only going to service a second airport if we decide to go ahead with one, but these are going to make these areas viable areas in themselves. For example, if we were to put in various road connections and then later to introduce the airport, why not get that extra value? We need solutions that are not just one facet, we need multifaceted solutions.
So you would say reserve the airport, but don't go ahead and build it yet until you've got everything in place.
Well, the land is already reserved. It's been reserved for years. It was written off when there was a push sort of 10 or 15 years ago to build the second airport at Badgerys Creek at that time, and it was written off as a site that was unviable to proceed with, but the land was reserved. We should certainly hold the land. A lot of the analysis that we do see is Badgerys Creek, the paddock, versus Badgerys Creek, the multi-billion-dollar international airport. Of course, the land could be used for other purposes, but if we hold the land now, we see that, in fact, we're not actually trying to just build a second airport. What we're really trying to do is to solve Sydney's connectivity requirements, and there could well be other ways to solve it which are better. So we should look at those other options, and if it's decided that we do in fact need a second airport and Badgerys Creek is a suitable site, then we have the land in reserve.
Good. Some journals have named baby Prince George as a Republican slayer. That's amusing, and it's true in part. The fact is that notwithstanding almost united media and two-thirds of the politicians, the 1999 referendum was a landslide no. Since then, Republicans have invented myths which are completely untrue. The principal one being that John Howard fixed the question. Well, he didn't. It was approved by the Cabinet and the Parliament, and half the Cabinet and two-thirds of the Parliament were Republicans. The fact is that support for a republic has been mainly in decline since the referendum. That's traced on the ACM site, norepublic.com. Just go to opinion polling, and you'll see that the trend over time and across the polls has been consistently downwards. Nowadays, the best the Republicans can command in a poll is support in the 30 percentile range. And that's for a vague, undefined republic. Once the Republicans reveal the precise details of what they're talking about, it tumbles even further. And there's more bad news for the Republicans. We've long established that the young are less Republican than the middle-aged. And if that's not bad news for the Republicans, there's worse. Polls and surveys are now telling us that the young are even more against the Republic than the elderly. It's a time bomb for the Republicans. In the meantime, Bob Carr, former Foreign Minister, has worked out how to get some sort of politicians' republic past the people. He says they should do what Malcolm Turnbull proposed in 1999. Take two words out of the question. First, the word president, and believe it or not, the word republic. Does Bob Carr really think the people are so stupid?
Well, Republicans must be depressed. They must be. I mean, looking at the opinion polls, as you've just alluded to, they must realise that their cause is just simply lost.
A few years ago, one of the Republican journalists said that the Republic, if it's not dead, it's comatose. What is it now?
Well, there's no doubt that it is a ticking time bomb. This is something which we know that young people are particularly supportive, certainly in the recent past, following only the very old. And now there seems to be this resurgence of even more support amongst the youth, and possibly this could be the William and Kate factor, the way that the royal family constantly renews itself, the connection with young people. What do you make of that?
Well, I heard you on 3AW a few weeks ago, and you happened to be talking about the young and a republic, and the head of the Australian Republican movement shouted you down and said that every poll over the last 30 years had shown that the young are more Republican than any other age group, which is palpably untrue.
Well, I'm still trying to work out whether the leader of the Republican movement is simply incompetent or whether he's a liar.
Well, on that point, I think we're pretty sure that the Republic's not going to be on the agenda, certainly in this term. For the last 4 months following the election of the Abbott government, not one boat under the control of the usual people smugglers has landed any illegal immigrants on Australian territory. Given that the ALP, the Greens and the Commentariat said that turning back the boats was just a slogan, that Tony Abbott could never achieve even 100 days free of illegal immigration, this has been a signal achievement both for the Prime Minister and for the Minister Scott Morrison. It was suggested that any attempt to do this would lead to hostilities with Indonesia. Now, the Rudd and Gillard governments, because they opened up the borders, had to then open 17 detention facilities across Australia. In the very first year of the Abbott government, they've closed 6. They plan to close 10 facilities by the end of the current financial year to save $2.5 billion at least over the next 5 years. This is a signal achievement.
This has been a remarkable achievement. And not only should we look at this in terms of the economic benefits, which of course you point to the closure of certain centres and so on, but people aren't dying. They're not dying at sea on their journey to try to reach our shores.
And this has been played down by the media generally. They play up one disaster, one problem in Manus Island where a person was unfortunately killed. They play that up, they make that headlines, and they talk about people who've had their hands burnt because they've been forced to touch hot pipes. But they don't talk much about this great achievement.
And what, of course, the other thing this means is that if we have a quota of people who we're going to accept on humanitarian grounds, we're taking the people who genuinely need it. We're not letting some person who's receiving money under the table to secure passage for somebody to decide who we accept in our country. We're taking people who are in genuine need and genuinely being persecuted in their countries.
Exactly.
One of the significant policies Tony Abbott took to the election was his signature paid parental leave scheme. And whether right or wrong, he has a lot of personal political capital invested in seeing this scheme come to fruition. Originally, he was suggesting a threshold of around $150,000, and this was reduced to around $100,000 in the budget. Is this an important, long overdue development for professional women, or is this a gold-plated scheme well beyond the role of government? It has been argued that women in the public service already have generous leave entitlements, but is the answer for government to create a similar condition for all women, or is the more appropriate response to remove the existing benefits to those people in the public sector?
I think there are two agendas here which we have to think of. One agenda is the long-term agenda of the left socialists, which is to destroy the family.
There's no doubt that that agenda exists.
And that agenda has in many ways been fulfilled. And one of the ways in which you could do this is to encourage women to have children without being married. And of course, naturally this is going to happen, but to actually have a government giving an incentive to this and breaking down the institute of marriage is an agenda. Now, this one of paid parental leave is the opposite. You may not like it, but its purpose is to allow women to have children, have them early, and stay in employment, go back into the workforce, because we do need people in the workforce. Only half the people in Australia are in the workforce, so we need more people in the workforce. Now, this is, I think, a positive agenda. If governments are going to get involved in regulating families, which I don't think they should, but if they're going to get involved in it, let them do it so that families stay together and children are born within families. This is so much better than Costello's baby bonus. That was an incentive for very sound families to have children, but it is also an incentive for single women living in unfortunate circumstances to have more children to get the bonus. And those children were brought into a very unfavourable circumstance about which President Obama has attacked.
Do you think that it's really a matter for people to decide themselves? And by that I mean that I have a young family and I earn well under the threshold that they're talking about here to qualify. So I would certainly fit within the criteria.
You asking for a raise?
What I don't feel is that I need the government to support me in that decision. I feel that I've arranged my life in such a way that I can live within my means. And we're talking about earlier in the show, budget repair and all these sorts of things where government has been living beyond its means. Equally, a family needs to live within its means. So I live in Sydney's western suburbs. I enjoy a comfortable lifestyle. I could have chosen to live closer to the city, for example, because both Teresa, my wife, works in the city, and until very recently I was in the city. That would have been a very convenient thing. But I made the decision, well, no, actually I'm going to live in Sydney's western suburbs where it's a little bit cheaper and I can live comfortably. And if I was to have children, I could still live comfortably. Why aren't people thinking along these lines rather than turning to government to say, support me in my decisions to do that, as noble as building the family to its former glory is?
Well, things have changed. My mother had to give up work. My father insisted on it, and she didn't like that. She would have been much more happy. In fact, she would have liked to have gone back to work, but she wasn't allowed to. Now, things are so different now. Women are expected to go into the workforce. The whole ethos of Australian society now is that women are liberated, they should do as well as men do, and they should have jobs. Now, the difficulty at the moment, as I see it, is that some women are getting an incentive not to work, and men too. Encouraging women to stay and work is a good thing. Encouraging them to have babies earlier, because women are delaying things now. They're delaying having the baby until an age quite often when it's not so good for them and may even be dangerous for them. I think if a system is in place encouraging them to have babies younger, that's a good thing.
We already have measures to support the family in place. We have family payments and so on for people who genuinely need it. If they're not earning sufficient income to support a family, there is subsidies that are provided for them. Having a threshold, I know we were originally talking about 150,000. We're now talking about 100,000, which is somewhat more reasonable. But at that level, do we really need to be providing subsidies to people in their decisions? And I know the public sector has it, but is the answer to provide a level playing field to all, or should we be looking at the entitlements of the public sector?
Right. Well, my view is if we're going to do this sort of thing, if the government is
should
going
we be
to,
doing it?
Well, a purist would say we shouldn't be doing it, but times have changed. Governments are expected to do much more than they did before. I mean, it was Menzies himself who brought in the child endowment. So things have changed. A British electoral judge, Richard Morey, was brought to Australia by Amy McGrath, the noted campaigner for electoral reform in 2010. His message was that easy voting is fraudulent voting. He found substantial electoral fraud both by Labour and the Conservatives in the United Kingdom. If we turn the clock back to the early 80s, when the Hawke government changed the electoral laws, their purpose, their stated purpose, was to make voting easier. That's what they said. This is to make voting easier. But no one was complaining that voting was difficult. In fact, we already had very easy voting. The voters turned out on the same day. We went to our specified subdivision. We all went to that polling station and we voted that way. Now, because of the recent Senate elections, a joint parliamentary committee has proposed changes to the voting. They were disturbed by what happened in the last election when the micro-parties got into the Senate. They've proposed the introduction of what's called optional preference voting, both above and below the line in the Senate. For the past 30 years or so, the political parties have effectively stolen your preferences. Once you've voted above the line, that is for a particular political party, and you just put one for that party, your preferences, and they're always a horde of preferences. Surplus votes go in the thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, and they're allocated not as you would want them, they're allocated according to the deals the political parties have made. And it's very difficult to find out on the Electoral Commission website what they've decided, how your preferences are to go. If you give one, for example, to the Labour Party or one to Family First, you've got no idea where they go. Now, the two major parties have decided to change this. Why have they decided to change something which applied over the last 30 years? They've only changed because the micro-parties have got into their racket, and they want to stop the micro-parties from doing this. One of the problems, of course, is we've got so many senators. We started out with 6. The Constitution, however, requires that the Senate be half the size of the House. And the political parties kept on wanting to have more politicians. For the first half century of our country, we got by very satisfactorily. We had good government with only 6 senators a state. They had to increase this to 10 because they increased the size of the House. Then they increased it to 12. Then they added senators for the territories. Anyway, the optional preference system will now mean you can vote for, say, 1 ALP, 2 DLP, 3 Family First, if you want to. You could just vote for 1 ALP, just what you want to do. The backroom deals will be abolished. No more will they steal your preferences. Clearly, this should also be extended to the House of Representatives, so you can just put in 1 for the party you want, 1 and 2, as many as you want. Why should you be forced to give a preference to a party you can't stand? That's what happens under the present system. And if we're to continue with compulsory voting, surely there's a conflict of interest in the politicians telling you you've got to vote, then getting a cash value from each vote. They get lots of money from these. Presently, they get $2.48 per compulsory vote, and altogether they got $56 million from the taxpayers. But there are other serious problems with our present system. Not only is it far too easy to enrol as a voter, they've even got automatic enrolment based on such so-called reliable sources as centre-link records. So you pull across fraudulent records and make them part of the electoral roll. Now we know that between the calling of an election and the closing of the rolls, there's a tsunami of enrolments which are impossible to verify, at least before the election. And because of the GetUp case, GetUp is a left-wing lobby group, because of the GetUp case just before the 2010 election, 100,000 extra voters came onto the rolls. Now that was a very close election, and GetUp claims the credit, because of those 100,000 extra voters, for the installation of the Gillard Labor Green government. Another thing we should do is do what we had to do in the 80s. That is, go back to subdivisional voting. That is, voting in a specified polling station. The present time I can vote in any of 20 polling stations. Now I would have to vote in one polling station. And we should also get a card from the Electoral Commission with a barcode on it, addressed to, say, David Flint. You're to vote here, this is the barcode. Then every polling station should have, they should be linked electronically so that when my name is crossed off in the polling station, it's crossed off in every polling station across the Commonwealth. It's crossed off in embassies and high commissions everywhere where people go to vote. And we ought to be able to again see the electoral roll and find out who else is living in our house, because people do enrol in other people's houses, who's living in the nearby cemetery, who's living on the side of the street where there's a park or the ocean. All of that is happening at the present time. We've got to change that. There is too much potential for fraud. Why hasn't it been cleaned up? It hasn't been cleaned up because some people are getting an advantage out of it.
Well, I think you've ticked just about every box there. I wanted to raise one thing with you, though, which I assume you would agree with my perspective on, and that is the difference, I think a very important difference, between an electronic roll, which I think is what you're talking about here, where you're scratched off and you can only vote once, and that's a very important measure to avoid fraudulent elections and so on, or fraud within elections, compared with the very different suggestion of electronic voting, which to me seems like a very big security risk. I think that even if we could find some way of technologically allowing this to happen, which I'm sure that the technology already exists, Australians, I think, will not be willing to accept that this system would guarantee, firstly, the anonymity of their vote, but also that there won't be some degree of fraud where that could be changed within a computer system.
You're absolutely right, I agree with you. When I go to vote, they say, oh, I say David Flint, and they say, oh, and they give me my address. I don't even have to remember that. And then they rule it off with a pencil. But it's available in every other polling booth, everywhere else in the Commonwealth, and I could go around Australia voting everywhere, and that should be stopped. That should be linked electronically so that they just click it off,
no doubt, on
the roll. But I agree with you, internet voting is risky. We need that paper trail. It would always be open to fraud, and I don't think we can trust leaving this to the politicians to handle in such a way that it isn't loaded so that all sorts of changes are made to your vote between you actually pressing the keyboard and it being transmitted.
Well, we'll just look at the Western Australian Senate election where they lost the ballot papers. Now that's a physical thing. Imagine how much more easily things could go astray or could be changed perhaps without even noticing when it's purely electronic. Yes. We must have that paper trail.
Yes, and there has to be a lot to be cleaned up. Why the Howard government do it when they had the control of the Senate, I don't understand. But I think there is an incentive for fraud in the present system, and the British judge showed that there was fraud by both sides in Britain. What he says is easy voting is fraudulent voting, and that's what's happening here.
Selling a new tax is an almost impossible task at the best of times. But despite regular claims to the contrary, John Howard did take his plans to introduce a GST to an election. There's now talk around raising the GST. Putting aside the ridiculously unfair way that the GST is distributed, and for example, Western Australia really does get the raw end of the stick, I must admit that there is a certain appeal in having a consumption tax rather than an income tax. But of course, the reality is that we're going to have both. And the concern is that politicians will double dip, not reducing income tax appropriately. How does this play into the wider issue of federal-state relations? Is this really a way of stopping tax avoidance?
There's no need to raise the GST. They've got enough money. They get enough money from the Australian people. They should just control themselves.
Do you think that, in theory, that if we were to have an income tax reduction, that it would be better to tax people on what they consume rather than what they earn?
I'd say I would only trust the politicians doing that if we had a system in which the politicians were truly accountable. If they could be, if their laws could be vetoed by the people, as they can be in Switzerland, if they could be recalled as they are in many states. But I wouldn't trust the politicians for 3 years or 4 years to change the GST.
Because of course, as a good as a good federalist, you would say that the states have a very important role to play. Now, when the federal government gives money to states on conditions, and I know that's a slightly separate issue to the GST, shouldn't we be allowing the states the ability to raise more of their own income and to spend it how they want?
They even rigged the GST so that it would reward bad governments and punish good governments. That's the equalisation formula. The idea being that you should be able to have the same services in every state, so you give Tasmania more and Western Australia less. But they then loaded the GST with the cost of running the territories, which are a federal responsibility. Now, if the GST really fell where it's collected, that would be different, but it doesn't. We should have the situation we used to have, we should have the situation they have in the United States, that is, that if you know that moving to Queensland will mean that you pay less tax than living in New South Wales, that's an ideal situation. Having uniform tax across the country is ridiculous because there's no possibility of the states competing with one another. Once upon a time we had that. That should be restored. That was the point of the Federation. The important thing about Bob Carr's book, Diary of a Foreign Minister, is not his preference for first-class airline travel, his rejection of food in swank hotels, nor his obsessive elitism and self-interest. It was his successful reversal of Australian foreign policy to comply with the electoral needs, as he saw it, of his party. As the prominent Labor MP, Michael Danby, claimed, Senator Carr had argued to the caucus, "How will I explain this on the steps of the Lakemba Mosque? How will I explain this on the steps of the Lakemba Mosque?" Mr Danby said Senator Carr had broken cabinet solidarity by betraying Prime Minister Gillard in a numbers campaign behind her back. Bob Carr denied this at the time, but in his book he now admits that this is correct. His move was designed to force a change in our policy of supporting Israel and about Palestinian statehood. His action forced Ms Gillard to change her position and to announce Australia would abstain from a UN vote on according observer status to Palestine as a non-member state. This abstention in the United Nations followed the spending of billions of dollars by the Gillard and Rudd governments to buy sufficient votes to get a temporary 2-year seat on the United Nations Security Council. They did this through the foreign aid budget. Mr Danby's intervention confirms that a principal reason for the change was the potential impact of a no vote in the General Assembly on Muslim voters in Western Sydney. So now, Australian foreign policy was on at least one significant occasion determined not in the interests of this nation or on a principle, but by a minority of voters. We've heard the same thing from a former Labor immigration minister about our immigration policy. Surely, Australian policy, foreign policy or immigration policy should be determined according to our national interest and not on the votes of key minorities and how it might attract them in particular seats.
How is it possible that 1% or 2% of the population, and it's not through their voting that this has occurred, this is through the fault of politicians, has been able to affect years of foreign policy?
Well, this is appalling, and it's Barry Jones apparently said as much on one occasion in relation to immigration policy, that it was keyed in a particular way. The minister in charge of immigration under Keating wanted to deport Sheikh Hilali on one occasion. Keating moved him so that Sheikh Hilali could stay in Australia so as to placate the possible Muslim vote in Western Sydney. Now, this is the wrong way to run the country, and this is yet another reason, Jai, another reason why we must make the politicians more accountable.
But I'm trying to get my head around it. Now, fundamentally, what is in it for him to have done it? Now, if he's trying to be re-elected, obviously he needs to appeal to the majority of Australians, certainly the majority of Australians within his electorate, although a senator is different, of course. How is it that he wants to pander to a minority? What's in it for him?
Well, what was in it for him was attempting to control the Labor Party and his assumptions about the way in which Australia would vote. He didn't know how the Muslims were going to vote in Western Sydney, but he wanted to change foreign policy so it would appear in a certain way which he thought would be more attractive to his constituency. Was
there a degree of differentiation to try and appear different within the Security Council?
I'm sure that was so too. But it's something which should not be tolerated, and he undermined the Prime Minister. Why do they hate our farmers? That's the title of a chapter in the book, Give Us Back Our Country. This is about the appalling way how, over the last few decades, all arms of government at all levels have waged a campaign against our farmers. This is not so surprising. Key parts of the government and the bureaucracy have been captured by the inner city elites who care little about farming. In the meantime, the power brokers who control the political parties have adopted aspects of the elite's agenda, while at the same time acting in the interests of big business, coal seam gas miners, developers, the retail duopoly, etc. The result is that while farmers are subject to ridiculously draconian laws about allegedly environmental matters, CSG miners can lay waste to farmers' land with impunity, enjoying free access to vast amounts of water and endangering our aquifers, the underground water. And when the farmers are not under direct attack, there is an indifference to the need to keep a sufficiently large number of Australians in agriculture and Australian land in Australian hands. This has been reflected in the undermining of the dairy industry, the cavalier approach to the quarantine, the persecution of farmers in relation to minor environmental matters, and a determination to impose coal seam gas mining on a very small part of Australia, the 4% which constitutes prime agricultural land. None of this would pass the pub test. That is, the test of rank and file Australians. Rank and file Australians would have the common sense not to do this. They don't like what governments are doing to our farmers. They're appalled that Australia, with her great agricultural tradition and the potential to be the much proclaimed food bowl of Asia, is being forced by government action to rely increasingly on food imports. Well, the chickens have come home to roost. The elites who think they are very smart and know all in relation to the economic future of this country have been shown to have seriously damaged the future wealth of the country. What they're doing, what they've done, is they damage the prospects not only of the farmers, they've also damaged the prospects of the great majority of Australians who live in the cities and who have nothing to do with farming. The truth is, we city dwellers are and will be more dependent on the farmers. We shouldn't let the politicians and bureaucrats get away with their tax on the farmers. We shouldn't do this not just out of respect for the hard-working farmers, who, after all, are the salt of the earth. We should be doing this for our own self-interest. You see, a significant report has just been released on the next big sectors of the Australian economy likely to boom. Readers will not be surprised to know that these industries do not include public administration, nor do they include banking, telecommunications, retail or transport. It all has to do with Asia, about which the elites think they know everything. The truth is they don't. A Deloitte report now tells us that Asia's increasingly prosperous nations will create 7 potential boom industries in Australia over the next 2 decades. All are ones in which we, Australia, have a comparative advantage. And with the top ranking of 16.2%, it is agriculture which is the star industry, well ahead of mining and gas. So the elites who saw the farmers as the enemy, watching them, persecuting them, stealing their property, forcing them to have mining on their land when they didn't want it, have been shown not only to be vindictive, they've been shown to have damaged the star sector of the economy. Just in itself, this is sufficient reason to demand that the politicians be made answerable to the people, not every 3 or 4 years, but all of the time. Shai.
Well, proponents, of course, tell us that mining or coal seam gas mining, you shouldn't really call it that, it's more a coal seam gas extraction, can coexist perfectly with farming. Of course, I was very curious about this point when on a television show, an ABC television show, I spent a number of days exploring the coal seam gas fields in Queensland around the Darling Downs. And we met this particular lady and her family. Her name was Debbie Orr, and she had a coal seam gas well located within close proximity of the premises, and she was claiming various health effects and so on. And what she was trying to say was that there had also been this increasing level of activity of gas escaping through a bore that she has. Now, from my understanding, and of course I'm not a farmer, but my understanding is that it's quite normal for gas to be present within a bore. But what really caught my attention was, why is it that when she complained about this increased level of activity and there was somebody sent to investigate this, their report denied the presence of any gas within the well? It wasn't that they said, oh, well, there is gas present, but we don't attribute it to coal seam gas activity within the area creating the increase. They denied the presence. And I could clearly see that when the appropriate equipment was used to measure the presence of gas within the well, there was some reading. I didn't understand the reading, but it showed that there was some presence. It would have appeared immediately obvious that it was there. Why was it not present within the report? It would seem that there is something underhanded going on.
And remember that 4% of Australia is made up of prime agricultural land. There's plenty of other land on which to have this form of mining.
But of course it's cheaper to do it close to the infrastructure.
Yes, you're closer
and that is the argument.
To the roads and so on. Well, the farmers, and there will be many farmers we hope watching this program, the farmers have to be looked after. They're entitled to be treated as well as other parts of the Australian community.
They're not second-class citizens.
Exactly.
As we said at the beginning, the theme of this program is Give Us Back Our Country. We will be reporting and commenting on current matters which demonstrate that in so many respects our country has been taken away from us. Rather than arguing that the answer is to elect the other major political party or even some brand new politicians, we say the solution lies in making the politicians truly accountable. And we say that there is a way to do this. It's not just some pipe dream. And that if sufficient pressure is put on the politicians, they will be forced to empower you, the people of Australia.
We argue that so many decisions of the politicians just would not pass the pub test. That is, they're something which your rank and file Australian just would never do. That's because the rank and file are endowed with common sense, decency and good judgment. It's time, then, that they were able to exercise far more control over the foolish decisions which our politicians so often make.
On that point, it's time to bring this first episode to an end. You can have your say on the topics that we've discussed today using the hashtag on Twitter, hashtag GUBOC, or GUBOC as we'll call it. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter using the Twitter handle @Martinkovits and also the Twitter handle @Prof David Flint.
So until next time, remember, give us back our country.